Hello, everyone. So let's see here. Let me get down the names.
Good evening, Professor.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm doing good, about Professor. How about you?
Doing well, doing all right, hanging in there. Weird times, huh? All this COVID
Oh
stuff,
my God,
all of us.
I don't know how long it's gonna take to it's gonna go over. It's been a long way. I mean, it's more than a year.
I
Everyone is
know.
pounding.
Yeah, it's something else. But I hope you guys and your families are well. Hope everyone is safe and healthy.
Yeah, everything is alright with me.
Good.
With my family, everything's good.
Yeah, it's we're in it together. It's definitely strange times, precarious. But again, I hope you guys are doing okay. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It says here 10 participants. So I have Larissa Gonzalez. I have Hamida. I have Nicole Eugenio. Um, could uh, could others please type or text your names? Those are the only three that are showing up on my end. Matter of fact, it even says 11. Okay. Prabtaj, Gil, Tristan, Kramal, Taranjeet, Joy, Melanie. Okay, good, good, good. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine. Okay, I think I'm missing one more. Let's see here. So Larissa, Hamida, Nicole, Prabtaj, Tristan, they have a Krumwall, Taranjeet, Joy, Melanie Lopez,
Abdul.
Abdul. Thank you.
Okay.
Wonderful, wonderful, guys. So noticed this week, right? It's just more of a just a standard factual thing. To be honest, the War of 1812 is just it stressed my intellectual capacity to make intelligent discourse out of this topic. So much of it is just factual. Nothing really changed as far as territorial um, entitlement between us and Britain. Kind of ended in a stalemate. A few things that kind of resonate, however, as common themes when you look at books or lectures on the War of 1812. One of them is that to a large extent, especially for the Democratic Republican Party, is it established a precedent of taking Native American lands because the Native Americans who chose to fight against us with the British in the War of 1812, as you see in the video, they were known as Red Sticks with their red tomahawks. Um, that's an ugly precedent, and it really didn't begin here. The Puritans did it back in the 1630s, but America is going to develop a reputation of having a certain MO that we follow with Native Americans that is going to lead to their demise, really. Um, so for one, right, is that the common theme of trying to consistently negotiate more land from them, the theme of settlers uh, intruding upon Native American lands, and the government not only beginning to concede that squatting, that trespassing on Native American lands was inevitable and unavoidable, but then also taking into the Fifth Amendment the government's responsibility to protect the lives, liberty, and property of its citizens. It's going to oftentimes, some people would argue that it was a pretext, a convenient excuse for the government to sit in strings of forts to protect the American settlers from Native American attacks. Not to mention the divide and conquer tactics diplomatically, whereby the chiefs are going to be courted to try to induce them to sell land to the United States. And when they did not do so, just overtly manipulative tactics and trying to, and basically in not taking no as an answer, whether it be bribing them, offering them bribes, which was a very typical method used during the colonial period, and the U.S. was no better in doing that, and also getting illegitimate leaders, leaders who did not necessarily, in the eyes of their tribes, were not necessarily entitled to speak on the behalf of their tribe, much less to decide for them upon land issues, to get those who were amenable to bribes and deals, to get them to sign treaties that other tribal members refused to recognize. And so you see that theme. And then at the end of the war, those tribes who decide to fight on the quote wrong side against the US, for there to be a very kind of vindictive, punitive element whereby the government refuses to acknowledge past treaties and entitlements of Native Americans to those lands, claiming that they forfeited those rights by becoming enemies of the United States and going back to international law, claiming their territories by the right of conquest. And so a lot to do with Native Americans in this War of 1812. Another common theme is that a very dangerous precedent of the ugly side, people would say, of democracy, of the democratic part of our republic, is in particular state legislators who are popularly elected, as well as congressmen, the House reps, obviously in the lower branch, popularly elected by their constituents, and offering land to settlers basically to buy their votes, right? To cater to their demands, their wishes, simply to buy their votes. What they might call kind of a quid pro quo system. Uh, Voters, you scratch my back by electing me, and I'll scratch yours. I'll give you in return the lands that you covet. Then another theme common in here is the notion of the ability and the willingness of Native Americans to assimilate. Of course, it was kind of an axiom, an assumption that wasn't questioned, which of course now is very questionable, but almost kind of a false dilemma in saying that, well, the Native Americans, in order to coexist with the states, right, they must drop their cultural practices, their religion, their hunting lifestyle, and settle down like good Americans and become Americanized, whatever that means, right? To become Christians, to become farmers, to engage in commerce and live amongst the white folk. That Thomas Jefferson and other presidents who established this kind of policy and this method of takeover made it clear that they felt like the Native Americans were backward, they were savage, but not by nature, but by nurture, by their civilization, by the culture in which they were brought up. So that if they would just be willing, in particular, to have their children go to mission schools and other institutions that would assimilate the kids and make good, quote, Americans of them, that was their only chance of living amongst the white man. And then if not, right, it was a common assumption that they ought to be expatriated. They ought to be forcefully pushed from their lands and to the West. And of course, there was paternalism involved, saying that it would be for their own good, that it would be for their own survival. This is an argument that we're going to get to soon with the Trail of Tears during Andrew Jackson's administration in the 1830s, where they're going to contend that, well, Native Americans, if you're not willing and able to assimilate, um, conflict will become inevitable. You'll become incompatible with the surrounding white civilians and citizens of the states around your territories. Because remember, the Constitution states that the Native Americans were nations within the nation, and they're to be directly under the authority of the federal government. So in some of these treaties that Congress is going to enact, they're going to grant them lands that happen to be within present and forming states. So let's say in particular the Cherokee later on with the Trail of Tears, primarily in the Carolinas, in Tennessee, and in Georgia. And so those states are going to have a problem. And not to mention, there's just going to be downright covetousness where the white settlers are going to covet, they're going to envy, they're going to desire the land that the Native Americans are on within their states. But technically, according to the Constitution, uh, that's not in the state's purview. The federal government, especially in a case called the McIntosh case, stated that the Native American tribes are, no matter what state whose territory they find themselves in, especially when that land has been recognized in a federal treaty, are immune from the certain laws of the states that try to impede upon their sovereignty, their ability to be their own bosses and arbiters of their own destiny in their own territory. And we're going to see that come to a head again soon with Andrew Jackson as president and his administration and his support of the states, which people argued was unconstitutional, again, because they're to be directly under the federal government. Then when you deal with treaties, right, you have you have the problem not only of tribal members splitting. Let's say, for instance, the Cherokee and the Creek, they tended to split along two lines. One was the line of North and South. Those in present day Tennessee and Kentucky in the northern regions tended to make deals with the government to either head west into present day Arkansas, or they made deals after wars with the Scots Irish and other settlers that came in, and they were more willing to negotiate with the federal government, as opposed to the Cherokee and Creek that were further south, like in Georgia, who refused to make those concessions. And so you had split along north and southern lines of the Cherokee and the Creek. They're going to disagree amongst one another. In those disagreement, you're going to have the component of the Native Americans uh, divided between civilian chiefs, right? They're kind of their political civilian leaders and their military chiefs. And oftentimes that tended to change, that often entailed an additional difference of age. A lot of the civilian chiefs were older sages who were looked upon for their age and their wisdom and from traditions. And then the younger ones who oftentimes tended to be less amenable to compromise and wanting to maintain their ways and refuse to touch the white man's pen and sign any agreements, especially giving away any of their land to the paleface, to the white man. Um, so you had those splits amongst the Native Americans. Um, you also had the split between, especially when you find the Cherokee and the Creek, is you early on by the time of George Washington's administrations in the early 1790s, he is going to commission New England Congregational and Presbyterian and other religious associations that were known as benevolent societies. He's going to send them, as well as hire and send artisans, skilled workers, etc., to go and live in these Native American communities and try to teach their children English, arithmetic, the basics of education, but also to convert them into Christians. And some of these traders had special treaties or special contracts where they could provide commodities and goods to the Native Americans. And then you had drama over them selling arms to the natives, which a lot of the white politicians and citizens didn't like. The idea of offering weapons to their prospective enemies. And you had I know it borders on the stereotypical, but you have plenty of primary sources to show this, is the controversy of providing alcohol, in particular whiskey, to the Native Americans, which, according to the primary sources, caused a lot of problems with alcoholism, domestic abuse. And you have a lot of statements from Native American leaders saying they no longer wanted these licensed merchants to be able to sell alcohol to their people, that it was ruining them culturally and socially, etc. And so there's a lot of variables, right? A lot of factors that are playing in. But along those lines is with the increase of missionaries as well as merchants who are mainly kind of WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, living amongst the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Creek. Many of them began to intermarry with Native American women, and so then you had a generation of biracial, right, of white and Native American leaders who became, by virtue of their mother's connections and mother's indigenous blood and standing in their tribes, to be leaders. So you had a generation by the early 1800s of biracial natives, and a lot of them tended to be more amenable to compromise with the white government, to have and even ask for benevolent churches and missionaries to come and teach their kids basic education and allow their kids to become Christian, etc. And of course, many of the full-blooded Native Americans took exception to this and saw this as an end to their ways, etc. In fact, to such an extent is you had people who would rise up and as religious leaders, as kind of shaman, and the white press called them prophets, Native American prophets. And you had quite a bit of them. You had a woman named Kukachu. You had a gentleman named Neolin, Neolin. Neolin in particular claimed to have had an epiphany and to have had a meeting with the Great Spirit, with God, to the Native Americans, and claimed that almost like a Moses, he was given a law of what Native Americans were to live by. And that law entailed staying away from the sins of the white man, staying away from his greed and commerce, staying away from his whiskey, staying away from his violent ways and weaponry, etc. And they began attracting large numbers of people following them and saying that we need to return to our native and retain our native indigenous ways and keep the white folk from influencing and diluting and corrupting our traditions, lest our creator become angry and let us lose to the white man and lose our lands. And so you had all kinds of variables that allowed certain unscrupulous white leaders in these regions to use the divide and conquer tactic, and to just work only with those who are willing to accommodate them and have them sign over lands, have them make treaties to bring in missions and schools, have them sign treaties to move to the West and give up their lands in favor of annuities. And annuities, like annual, were yearly supplies of various kinds. And of course, to many people, right, you had some well-meaning missionaries who thought that this was a benevolent act, that it was for the own good of the natives to be moved to the West where they would stay safe from white encroachment, but also so that they would be taken care of by the government with these annual supplies and money payments, etc. But then you had the unscrupulous who, for ulterior motives, were pushing the very same things, wanting to push them to the West, not for their own good, but to just simply take their land, and wanting them to become assimilated so that they could have power over them. And so you had various different parties, right? So all this is going to allow the white man to kind of divide and conquer the Native Americans. Another force, another contention, a part of the divide and conquer tactic, were the tribal wars amongst the Native Americans. While they're clearly the victims in this case, and you will go over some of the very unfair treatment they incurred, especially when we do the Trail of Tears. Um, you did have the fact that they were not always just peaceful amongst one another, but they were conquering one another's lands and vying commercially to see who could provide the white traders with the most commodities and enrich themselves and their own tribes, more so than their rival tribes. And so at certain treaties, you have, for instance, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768, whereby the Ohio Valley and Kentucky were sold by the Iroquois, but those weren't even ancestral lands of the Iroquois. They weren't even the rightful owners and leaders of that land, where they become leaders, but by conquest. And they contended, hey, you under European tradition from the very get-go have claimed land legally entitled to you by conquest, and so we should be no different. And so the Wyandots, the Ojibwas, the Winnebagos, the Shawnee, the Delaware, they took exception to this and said, who in the heck are the Iroquois to make the decision to sell our lands, right? The same way as the Choctaw, Cherokee, and Creek native and military leaders said, who are these biracial, whitewashed civilian leaders amongst us to make decisions on our behalf to sell our lands? And so it was a messy, messy situation, right? In the Ohio Valley, around the Great Lakes, in the states of Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, in the present day states through the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee and Kentucky, and also down in the South, Georgia in particular, and the Carolinas. So it's a messy, messy situation. But early on, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and I would say even between them, John Adams as well, is they use somewhat of an aggressive, savvy policy whereby they would appoint military governors over these disputed lands. And the military governors were asked to first and foremost try to engage in treaties with the natives to get them to sell as much as their land as possible, again, under the assumption that they could not control their own white Americans' migrations and movement into the frontier. And so that there would be less bloodshed and drama, they wanted to convince them and buy them off to sell their lands. But the problem is when they were unwilling to, again, some of these leaders played the perfect villain and either go into illegitimate leaders to get them to unfairly sign away their tribes' territories on behalf of everyone else of their tribe, or even to declare war. And oftentimes in declaring war, all they needed was a pretext. And oftentimes, with the case of the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Creek, especially, not to mention the Shawnee, is when they had not given their okay to move from a certain land and to share or sell certain land, and white encroachment happened with pioneers coming into their territory, they would attack them. And sometimes they would kill and mutilate the bodies as a message. And so the press is going to play a role also in showing how awful and how barbaric the Native Americans are, and how these poor settlers are being slaughtered, just trying to achieve their American dream and going and squatting on land and making a farm and business and life for themselves. Never mind the fact that they were illegally trespassing and land that the rightful tribal leaders had not agreed to giving up. So it was a messy, messy thing. And so the next step what these military governors would do is they would begin establishing strings of forts, saying, well, according to the Fifth Amendment, we have to protect the lives, liberty, and property of American citizens, even if they are illegally squatting on land not their own. And the Native American tribal leaders, oftentimes the young warriors especially, uh, to them this was unbearable, and so they would attack the forts and you would have fighting. So you had Lieutenant Colonel John Sevier in Kentucky and Tennessee, who was given latitude, and he did a lot of fighting. And then Lord Dunmore's war is going to break out in Tennessee and Kentucky, where the Virginia governor, Lord Dunmore, is going to give ultimatums to the tribes to sign treaties, or else he would declare war on them. And so, like I said, Colonel John Sevier, you had in the Ohio Valley, you had Arthur St. Clair, Josiah Harmer, Anthony Wayne, and then ultimately William Henry Harrison, who were sanctioned by the federal government to come in and try to buy as much land as possible, try to survey the land and open it up to purchase on the public market for white settlers to purchase it. And the Native Americans took exception to this. And at this time, there was one particular medicine man, aka like a Native American prophet, whose name was Tenskwatawa of the Shawnee tribe, and he began having like a religious awakening amongst the natives, whereby he kind of like Neolin before him contended that the Great Spirit had spoken with him and said to get away from the white man's corrupt ways and to unite all the tribes that had been fighting amongst one another and get them to collectively push out the paleface, the white man, from their territory. So William Henry Harrison plays a good villain in particular, being chosen as the governor of Indiana and by the Great Lakes. Is he made it very clear that by today's standards he was very racist, very arrogant and condescending toward the natives, didn't think that they were ever even able to assimilate, much less even wanted to. And he is going to start fighting dirty and trying to bribe non-leaders into signing treaties, try to extend the number of forts that were in the area, and also tried to denounce and even wanted to arrest Tenskwatawa for stirring up trouble amongst the Native Americans. And Tenskwatawa had a brother who famously was known as Tecumseh. And Tecumseh is going to raise an army. He travels all the way down the Mississippi and gets the Natchez, the Choctaw, and the Southern tribes to join the Shawnee, and in particularly the Creek, to fight and kick the white man out of the Ohio Valley. And the British at first were the enemies of the natives as well, because they bought a lot of that land without the Native American tribes leaders' permission from, again, the Iroquois, who claimed that they conquered that area and that it was their decision. Um, and of course, that wasn't right. That wasn't true, nor ethical for them to sell it on behalf of the other tribes. And so that's going to lead to hostilities. So hostilities were, it's not as if the War of 1812 was a sudden war with the natives on the frontier region of the Alleghenies to the Mississippi, from the top of the Great Lakes down to Louisiana. It had been going sporadically on and off for years, but it's going to really culminate with Tecumseh, and this is going to help establish the War of 1812, as you see in the video, right? So remember, this is not an argumentative assignment. You're just asked to watch the PBS video on the War of 1812 and simply answer the questions, the list of questions that I pose to you. So note, technically, one of the two reasons why we went to war was one was because of we contended that the British were fomenting, were stirring up as provocateurs, were stirring up the Native Americans to fight against us in that western frontier region up and down the Mississippi. At the Battle of Tippecanoe, for instance, when we won that battle as a country under Harrison's troops, they found amongst the dead natives as they were burying them lots of British muskets, and they saw that there had evidence that there had been a deal made between Tecumseh and the British authorities. So we thought that the British were fomenting insurrection of the natives against us, right? Because technically they're supposed to be a nation under our nation's control, under the federal government's protection and prerogatives, according to the McIntosh case. And so the second one, as you see in the video, they make very clear, is the Napoleonic Wars are going on, and Great Britain began to violate our rights as an international nation. You don't have Geneva until the 1850s, but you still had many conventions in Europe that established international laws that were to be abided by all the civilized countries during war. And at the heart of those laws was the notion that a neutral country has a right to trade with one or both countries at war, technically called belligerents. And that international right of our soldiers and of our merchants was being infringed upon, right? You look at the Chesapeake Leopard incident and other incidents in which the British stopped American merchant ships, confiscated their goods that were on their way to trade with the French, and then also even confiscated and took, they called it impressment, some of the American sailors and men working for the merchant ships on the high seas, who they claim were runaway British sailors, and they conscripted them back. And there was a system of birth certificates that was being established in the early 1800s, but extremely primitive prior to photography. So they literally would make uh, a grown man sketch of the person. They would write when and where the person was born and what state and to what parents and what year. And so there became a system of the British buying forged counterfeit birth certificates, who had run away from the British Navy and wanted to disguise themselves as American merchant sailors. So there was some truth to the fact that some of those who were impressed on American ships by the British Navy were actually British runaways. But as you can guess, a system that's that messy uh, was going to lead also to literally thousands of Americans who had never been born in England, never even seen England, to be uh, illegally and unethically taken by the British and impressed into their navy. So those were the two technical reasons for which we went to war. You look in the video at our failed expeditions to try to invade Canada, which obviously Canada being sovereign to this day under Great Britain, that obviously didn't work. And so you look at some of the fiascos there. You look at the ruthlessness with which we fought the Native Americans. You could look at the Fort Mims massacre, whereby settlers went to Fort Mims in Alabama and felt like they'd be safe from the Creek Red Sticks who fought with the British. And the Creek Red Sticks attacked the fort and slaughtered all the people, women and children included. The press ran with that, and the young Andrew Jackson claimed that they would be avenged, those victims. You had the Duck Creek Massacre in Tennessee or Kentucky. I apologize, I forget which one. So both sides were massacring one another. And so it got to the point where the Americans were convinced that a lot of the Native Americans, because of course they were promised their territorial integrity by the British if the British were to win. And so there was a large assumption that the majority of Native Americans were fighting against us instead of with us. So some innocent people and some even allies who intended to ally with us instead of Britain were were immorally killed by militiamen and in our army, and as well by private citizens, and massacres going back and forth from both sides. So it was a messy, bloody war. It was a short one. The casualty list, as far as numbers, wasn't very high, but it was still pretty bloody. And so, with the Native Americans at the end of the war, anyone that was associated with the Red Sticks who chose the side of the British was to be punished, and their land was to be confiscated at the end of this war. Okay. And so, those are some of the major elements of this war. Another thing that we look to in the War of 1812 is we have a new generation, and really it wasn't a new thing because we did it with the founding fathers, George Washington, highest amongst them, is we're going to begin to elect war heroes and establish our own sense of cultural identity and cultural independence. By the end of the War of 1812, for instance, something as symbolic as just Noah Webster's dictionary, whereby he would change some of the wording and some of the spelling of a lot of English words and make it an American dictionary, so that we jokingly have an American English language, not just the English language proper. That was seemed to be symbolic, that we were declaring cultural independence from England. And so the War of 1812 had a unifying effect in which it unified Americans against a common foe, two common foes, obviously, the British as well as the Native American Red Sticks who fought against us. So it helped bring about unity to such an extent that the Federalist Party, for reasons I don't have time to get into, was going to fall apart shortly after the War of 1812. And we're literally going to go through a period of only one party ruling, and that's Jefferson's party of the Democratic Republicans. But ironically, they're going to embrace Jefferson's image, or Jefferson's system, right? And what Henry Clay is going to entitle it, kind of, to me, shows a lot of the spirit behind the Liberal Party being the only party now, but yet they embraced the conservative Hamilton system of subsidizing business, getting bond money from the rich, trying to become an industrial giant. He called it the American system because very generically he said it is a patriotic decision, no longer a conservative decision, for us to become self-sufficient and not be in need economically of Great Britain or any other European power. And so that kind of unity is going to follow as well. And some of the war heroes you're going to see in the video, Andrew Jackson, of course, amongst the top, a gentleman named Stephen Decatur, and then the Oliver Hazard Perry are a few of the leading examples that become war heroes and kind of unify the country under a spirit of patriotism. You also had the problem with the failed invasion of Canada, problems with Americans' aversion to any kind of a draft and fighting under the National Army, because again, libertarian beliefs were strong, whereby each state and local area wanted to raise their own troops, keep them independent as their own fighting unit, and not be subjugated by some large central command of the federal government. So that's another theme to show the survival of libertarian beliefs at this time, whereby Americans wanted to fight in decentralized, more democratic fashion. Democratic because the local militias democratically elected and chose their own officers. All right. So those to me are the major themes connected to the War of 1812. You'll notice in the video the origin of the Star Spangled Banner when the British tried to bombard Fort McHenry in Baltimore to get into the White House at Washington, D.C. We're going to stubbornly hold out until the British pretty much literally run out of ammunition and give up. And Francis Scott Key was there as a diplomat to try to sign some kind of peace treaty or a truce. And he saw that the flag was battered from being bombed and the buildings were, but that flag was still up early in the morning that he didn't expect. So that kind of, again, patriotism running rampant at the end of the War of 1812. So are there any questions so far? Any questions at all?
No, Professor.
Thank you. All right, no problem. So really, you guys, in this one, I'm just simply asking you to, thank you, Tristan, to just simply watch the video. And I'm sorry if it's a little dry and long, but please watch that PBS video and just simply answer those questions. And it's really that simple. And recall also that next week you will have your test number 2. So we'll have a meeting again, and I will gladly go over anything that you have as far as last minute questions for the test. So this coming Sunday evening, you'll have the War of 1812 assignment due. And then the following Sunday evening, you'll have test 2 due. Okay, and so again, I'll be here again next week with a willingness to answer any specific questions on the test. All right, so okay, so thank you, Prabtaj. And so so if there aren't any questions, I mean, that's it, guys. It's kind of a shorter session this time. Remember, you have Canvas message to message me you're absolutely welcome, Abdul. Thank you. And again, I appreciate you guys being a part of this, as I will, with your War of 1812 assignment, I will give you extra credit for making it to this meeting. That's the least I can do and show my appreciation. Joy, thank you. Prabtaj. So you guys have a nice week. Good luck with everything in your personal lives. Be careful with this COVID, and I wish you and your families well. I really do. And we'll go ahead and call it quits for today, okay?
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay,
Thank you,
guys?
Professor.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Thank
So-
you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank
great day.
you.
Have a great week.
You too. Thank you very much, every one of you. I appreciate that dearly. All right. Have a good week.
You too. Bye.
All right.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.